When Washington Crossed the Delaware by Lynn Cheney. Painting by Peter M. Fior. It was November 1776, a time of trouble for our young country. We were fighting for our independence from Britain, and the war was not going well. The British had defeated General George Washington and his men on Long Island, had driven them out of New York, and were pushing them across New Jersey. George Washington was discouraged. How could the Americans, who were mostly new to fighting, ever hope to defeat the well-trained redcoats? The rebels fly before us. William Bamford, Captain, British Army. The Americans retreated through cold and rain. Many had no jackets to keep them warm. Many had no shoes and marched with rags wrapped around their feet. Everyone was hungry. In early December, the Americans made it across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. Under General Washington's order, they had taken every boat they could find with them, so they knew they were safe from the British for a while. But they were sick, exhausted, and cold. Even when the struggle seemed hopeless, George Washington did not give up. On the other side of the river, the British had stationed Hessians, German soldiers the British had hired to fight for them. The Hessians didn't have much respect for American soldiers. They didn't think the Americans would do anything bold or daring. And so George Washington decided on a bold and daring course. He called a meeting of his generals and worked out a plan. On Christmas night, American troops would cross the Delaware River in several different places. Before dawn on December 26th, they would attack the Hessians at Trenton, New Jersey. Washington warned his officers to keep the plan a secret. It could only succeed, he believed, if Americans caught the Hessians by surprise. Also crucial to success was the spirit of the American troops. Beaten down as they were, could they fight another battle? A man named Thomas Paine had marched with the Americans as they retreated across New Jersey. Now he came up with words to encourage them. "These are the times that try men's soul," he wrote. "The summer soldier and the sunshine patriots will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of a man and a woman." In the camps along the Delaware, George Washington's men read Paine's word and drew strength from them for the battle ahead. On Christmas night, 1776, General Washington led 2,400 men, the main body of his army, to a crossing point about 9 miles upstream from Trenton. There, the soldiers crowded into the large black boats that would take them to the opposite shore. The night was cold, and the men faced a difficult crossing. They had to break through the ice to get the boats into the river. They had to fend off large chunks of floating ice once they were underway. But Washington had seafarers with him at night who knew how to navigate treacherous waters. The sailors of Massachusetts Marblehead Battalion maneuvered boats after boat across the icy river. As soon as they got one group of men to the New Jersey shore, they returned to pick up another. Washington arrived on the New Jersey side of the Delaware in the early hours of the crossing. Wrapped in his cloak, he watched his cold, wet soldiers make their way onto land. Their spirits were good, but he was worried. The crossing was taking longer than he had planned. Washington's army had 18 cannons, and getting them across the river was especially hard. A gun with its carriage and ammunition could weigh 2,000 pounds, and loading it on and off a slippery ferry was slow and dangerous work. Downstream, 2 of Washington's commanders also struggled to get men and guns across the river. In the end, neither General James Ewing nor Colonel John Cadwalader could get through the ice on the Delaware. They had to give up on the idea of fighting at Trenton. But at 3 o'clock in the morning, George Washington's crossing succeeded. The last gun was on shore, and the general and his men prepared for the 9-mile march to Trenton. Perseverance accomplished what at first seemed impossible. Henry Knox, Colonel, Continental Army. It was 4 o'clock in the morning before the army was ready to move out, hours later than Washington had planned. He had hoped to attack the Hastings while it was still dark, but now the sun would be up before Americans reached Trenton. Would an attack in daylight still be a surprise? But there was no turning back. Through cold and sleet, the American troops moved along icy roads towards Trenton. Washington and his officers rode alongside the men, encouraging them onward. Remember now what you are about to fight for. General George Washington. When the Americans encountered the first Hastings, it was clear that the surprise had worked. The startled Hastings retreated. The Americans pressed forward with such determination that the Hastings had little time to organize a defense. When American artillery began to bombard them, the German soldiers had no choice but to abandon the streets of Trenton and withdraw to an orchard nearby. 19-year-old Captain Alexander Hamilton led one of the companies firing at the Hastings. He would later sign the U.S. Constitution and help ensure that the states accepted it. He would become our country's first Secretary of the Treasury. Another soldier fighting that day was 18-year-old Lieutenant James Monroe. When the Haitians managed to get 2 of the cannons into operation, Monroe was one of the officers who charged the guns. He was badly wounded, but he would live to become our nation's 5th president. The Haitians tried an attack of their own. With drums beating, they marched from the orchard towards the center of town. But the Americans were strong. In the fight that followed, the Haitian commander, Colonel Johann Rau, was mortally wounded, and many of his men were killed. The rest of the Haitians retreated, but the Americans soon had them surrounded. 2 German regiments decided it was time to quit fighting, and they lowered their flag to the ground. Then the 3rd and last regiment surrendered. 2 hours from the time it had started, the Battle of Trenton was over. With few losses of their own, the Americans had captured nearly 900 Hastings. After many defeats, they had won a great victory. This is a glorious day for our country. General George Washington. Most of Washington's men had the right to go home at the end of the year, but Washington needed them to stay. Persuading them to keep fighting would be hard, he knew. He could see how tired they were as they transported their Hastings prisoners across the Delaware to Pennsylvania. He could see that they were cold. Many marched without shoes and left bloody footprints in the snow. Once his men were back in New Jersey, Washington promised extra pay to those who would serve longer, and he appealed to their love for their country. This was an hour of destiny, he told one regiment, a time that would decide America's fate. If they wanted their country to be free, they had to keep fighting. Drums rolled. A few of the men stepped forward, then more, and then more. Many of Washington's battle-tested soldiers resolved to stay at his side. There were thousands of British and Haitian troops gathering at Princeton, New Jersey, a pretty college town northeast of Trenton. Certain that they would soon attack, Washington sent out a call for more forces. Veteran fighters joined him, as did many men who had never fought before. Washington ordered most of his troops to line up along the ridge on the south side of Assunpink Creek. He also sent a force to the north side of the creek, where the British and Haitians were advancing. Washington ordered these men to slow the enemy down. I pressed against the shoulder of the general's horse and in contact with the boots of the general. The horse stood as firm as the rider. John Howland, Private, Lippett's Rhode Island Regiment. Near evening on January 2nd, 1777, the troops sent to delay the British had done all they could. They ran for a narrow bridge that would take them across the Assunpink. As they crowded onto it, they saw General George Washington at the far end. The enemy was right behind them, but the sight of their commander, firm and steady, gave them courage. General Charles Cornwallis, the British commander, thought he had Washington trapped. He thought he could wait until morning to attack the Americans, but Washington had other plans. He knew that Cornwallis had brought most of his forces with him. That meant there would be far fewer of the enemy in Princeton, and so Washington readied his army for a march that would take them around Cornwallis's troops and towards the college town. He ordered some of his men to stay behind. They were to keep campfires burning and to make noise with their axes and shovels so the British wouldn't realize what the Americans were doing. About 1 o'clock in the morning on January 3rd, Washington and the main body of his army moved out. Cannon wheels were muffled with rags. Officers whispered order. The Americans did everything they could to be quiet, and their plan worked. It was dawn before Cornwallis realized they were gone. The morning was clear and cold as Washington and his men neared Princeton. In farmland outside the town, a part of the American army encountered British troops. During the fight that followed, many of the Americans fell. The day's survivors retreated. Washington rushed to rally his troops, and astride a white horse, he led them forward, taking them within 30 yards of the British line. American muskets were pointed at the British. British arms were leveled at the Americans. Washington was in between. Once the two sides started firing, it seemed impossible that he would survive. Muskets roared, but when the smoke cleared, General Washington was safe. His troop held steady, but the British line broke and fell back. The Americans advanced. British officers tried to rally the redcoats, but soon they began to flee. When the American troops ran after them, Washington paused just long enough to give a few orders. Then, spurring his horses, he joined in the pursuit. "Away, my dear Colonel, and bring up the troops. The day is our own." General George Washington to Colonel John Fitzgerald. Within a few hours, the battle was over. George Washington and his men had once again defeated the greatest military power in the world. General Washington and his men had stood with their country in a time of crisis. When they were cold and hungry, they did not quit. When the conflict was hard, they fought on. And when they won, the victory was sweet. News of Trenton and Princeton spread across the land, lifting the spirits of the patriots everywhere. Many a battle lay ahead. But now Americans could think of winning their war for independence. Now they can imagine that their great struggle would have a glorious end.